7th presentation in Hermetic America. And I'd like to start off by showing a little bulletin. This is from 1919, and this is the first bulletin of the National Research Council. And as you might know, the NRC is one of the world's most powerful councils. It runs the United States military from the executive branch. And this bulletin, October 1919, published in Washington, D.C., The National Importance of Scientific and Industrial Research, cinching not only industry with science, but folded into that little braid was American education. If you get curious, years and years ago, a man named Robert S. Callahan did a book published by the University of Chicago Press called The Cult of Efficiency, the Inculcation of Business Practices in Education in America. The reason was that at the end of the First World War, there was a liminal knife edge of opportunity in two different ways. One was to embrace a larger world in the League of Nations. The other was to embrace a surge of an American empire. And that came to a decision because the great protagonist for the League of Nations, Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, had a sudden heart attack situation and was, for all intents and purposes, incapacitated, and that was not released to the public. And quietly behind the scenes, easier to do in those days, his new wife, Edith Bowling Wilson, and several very powerful people associated in the executive and behind the scenes branch of the American government took over education, science, and the industrial political economy surged in the 1920s, was a spectacle. It's famous as the 20s. And it's famous because right at the end of the 20s, 10 years after this, in October 1929, came the Great Market Crash, followed by the Great Depression, that was only exited, finally, by an entry into World War II in 1941. So that we have, in the United States, in its history, in its actuality, some of the most profound archetypes in the world. And the reason for this is that the United States has always been founded on an archetypal soil, on a massive complexity of base and expectations, of projections into those expectations on the basis of classic archetypal power structures in world history. But seeded through that, as if it were a skein of golden threads, is the actual visionary core of the human race. This is Hermetic America, because the illumination of that skein of precious threads has woven itself is, it will do archetypally again and again in significant individuals who learn that their individualism is insufficient for the range of their visionary scope. And so they transform themselves patiently, and in doing so transform the world around them, such that we have now, over the last 300 years, some of the most spectacular human beings that have ever achieved personhood. The art of being a prismatic person, able to function in a pragmatic world, and to not only get things done, but to make new things that never were and get them accomplished. The two most important persons in 1919 were Elihu Root, who was Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State, and George Ellery Hale, who is one of the world's greatest astronomers. And it is George Ellery Hale that gives us a chance to understand the spectacular surge in capacity in one lifetime. Again, what's important here is that a lot of the Hermetic America story is Boston and Philadelphia and Virginia, and as we will see, California, but again and again, Chicago emerges as a fulcrum for Hermetic America that has maintained its position over the last 150 years in a remarkable way. We're going to come back to George Ellery Hale. We're going to come back to the great new visions of astronomy that culminate in our time in the Hubble Space Telescope and the projected James Webb Space Telescope that will be truly a monumental achievement in human technology. The earliest figure in Hermetic America is Benjamin Franklin. He is the first one to understand, even as a teenager, that his person was teachable on a self-teachable level, that he could find out on his own recognizance, and on the basis of that recognizance, he could begin to make accomplishments that could be enlarged, that would reflect back to him the deepening and the heightening of his personal capacities. All of this goes back to an ancient realization 2,000 years ago. And the focus of that realization was in ancient Alexandria. And the man who was the center of that focus was Jesus. Jesus in Alexandria. We are acquainted with a doctrine and a mythology and archetypes that identify him with 3 years of his life, the last 3 years of his life, and call all the rest of it lost years. The fact is, Jesus was about 45 when he was crucified and resurrected, and those 42 years are not only the formative years of the man, they are the formative years of his achievement. And not just formative, but very much like a Benjamin Franklin, of putting into place and into practice qualities of expansion to a jeweled person capable of addressing through a vision the entirety of the cosmos. This, 2,000 years later, can be presented quite distinctly by this cover of the Harvard Divinity Bulletin, the Harvard Divinity School. Here is a young, wondering cosmologist looking at the constellation of stars that are like an echo of his posture of wondering, of his dedication to inquiring. And the caption is, "Cosmic Birth, Must Cosmologists Be Myth Makers?" The reason for this, and for the emphasis here for the Harvard Divinity School, emphasizing that cosmology not only does not necessarily be myth-making, a mythic basis, but can have a scientific quality to it that includes theory. And that while science is a culmination of theory, theory is best understood as not just something made up, which is a mythological designation of theory. The Greek word theoria means contemplation. It means considered focus, to wonder and to carry out the wonder in the practice of an inquiry, and that practice of the inquiry in its largest harmonic is education. So that the whole quality of an education is of a learning which can be not only received from teachers, but one can become a self-teacher, and in this way have a dialogue of cooperation, not only between oneself and one's teacher, or oneself and one's teachers, but between others who are able to have an inquiry as well, and that there are times where it is not the teacher that is important, but it's the community of the inquirers. And this is what the internet demonstrates to us in the current sociality. There are hundreds of millions of inquirers, and they do not need a teacher, but what they can make use of is a way of learning where all the teachers and all the inquirers of the entire human heritage, a planetary treasure trove, is available to them, and to have what navigators always have depended upon: a compass and an ocean chart and a sextant to align oneself to the stars and the ocean map, and the capacity of the tools of navigation to bring those into a successful interchange and interplay, so that one can go from port to port, planet round, at your own courage and convenience. The United States has, over the last 300 years, contributed more than any other group of human beings in planetary history, and has become a focus in a prismatic way, as a lens, to be able to understand that our capacities have not only morphed, but transformed, and further, that the transforms have become transformable themselves, So that there is now a fruitful understanding that not only is our species now planetary in its culture, but that its lensed possibilities are throughout the entire star system. And we will become a stellar civilization species in the next 100 years, the next 3-4 generations at the most. One of the qualities that's there is that Americans are the first human beings since Paleolithic times to be able to reorient themselves so that the challenge of a wilderness is not a fearful proposition, that a wilderness is meant to be explored, to be inquired into, to be an enlargement, a resonance into a harmonic, as John Muir once remarked, meant to match my mountains. There used to be little collections like this, Fourth to the Wilderness, the first American frontier, the Appalachian Barrier, the Blue Ridge Mountains, and to be able to go through them, over them, through the passes. At one time, just a few individuals in buckskin who had learned to become white Indians, learned to live like the protagonist in James Fenimore Cooper's Leatherstocking Tales, learned to be a member of a primordial American Indian family whose adopted father, Chingachgook, and whose adopted brother, Uncas, the last of the Mohegans, were his family, and was free not only to go through the Appalachian Barrier and beyond, but towards the end of his long life in his 80s, dying out on the western prairies, dying out someplace in the Nebraska-like stretch of the continent. And the last moment of his life, he heard his name called by the wilderness which had become his home. And his last word is, "Here, I am ready." Here. This quality has a peculiar resonance in our time. At 2008, we are coming up on the 40th anniversary in a couple of weeks of the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy in June of 1968, right here in Los Angeles at the Ambassador Hotel. This 40 years in a political wilderness, in a national wilderness, will be punctuated next year in 2009 by another 40-year emergence out of the wilderness. It will be 40 years to the day in late July of 2009 that Americans first went to the moon. That this was indeed a press of Hermetic America inquiry by impossible expansions of human capacity that 10 years before would have been considered and was considered purely science fiction. In July of 1959, I was avidly reading science fiction as a teenager, and I can tell you, everyone looked upon it as science fiction stuff kids read. And us kids certainly read it. But in 1969, when it actually occurred and happened, that summer was published a fantastic book by Harlow Shapley, Through Rugged Ways to the Stars. Now, Harlow Shapley was the director of the Harvard University Observatory and had been so not only for years, but for decades. Harlow Shapley's first little book is published, and it was called Starlight, published by George H. Doran Company, 1926. And it came out because Starlight was the companion volume to a book that came out also in 1926. And this was The Universe of Stars, published by the Observatory, Cambridge, Massachusetts, 1926, radio talks from the Harvard Observatory. The radio talks were given because there were very few radio stations in 1925, 26. They were given on broadcasting station WEEI, the Edison Electric Illuminating Company of Boston. And they were later repeated by WRC, the Radio Corporation of America, Washington, D.C. And that these radio talks, the University of Stars and the Starlight, within 3 years, led Shapley to make this source book in astronomy, one of the McGraw-Hill technical series, largely engineering and math. This was one of the early presentations that the source book in astronomy was to get a complex vision that was layered by a scientific tradition of inquiry that led in a funnel outwards in such a way that the farthest reach of the lens exceeded the stars. And in 1943, the Harvard Books of Astronomy series published Shapley's Galaxies. Our galaxy was shown from the south pole of our galactic region, and the two clouds of Magellan are here in the photograph in the Southern Cross. So that Shapley's 1969 Through Rugged Ways to the Stars culminated about a third of a century of his work. And it was about this time that his daughter, Mildred, who married a man named Matthews, so her name is Mildred Shapley Matthews, she was born in 1914, the beginning of World War I. She's still alive, she's still working, she's still publishing, and her great series is with several other editors, published by the University of Arizona Press. This is Protostars and Planets 2. They did an earlier one. Mildred Shapley Matthews. In 1991, she edited the huge volume on Uranus. And in 1992, she helped edit this monumental volume on Mars, which will only be improved upon in the next couple of years when all of the Mars exploration series, I guess you know in another week, the Mars Phoenix will be landing near the Martian northern regions to search for life, to search for water. It is this quality of being able to pass on a tradition and enlarge it constantly that gives us in the 21st century a Hermetic America which is extraordinary. which has resonances now all over the planet, not in terms of an empire, but in terms of a prismatic, jeweled necklace of human capacity that exceeds the planet. It exceeds the reach of empires, and it is like 1919. This year is one of those thresholds where it can go either way. In 1969, already after 1968, the planned 20 Apollo missions to the moon were cut and curtailed. And at first it seemed like it was super cautious to only take incremental steps at a time, little baby steps. But finally it became apparent, because the last 3 Apollo missions to the moon were co-opted. They never occurred. And the first co-opting was to make one of the Apollo missions into Skylab, the first great space station. But the 3 further Apollo missions to the moon would have given a springboard for a lunar base. And the next stage of planning was to go to Mars. And the mission to Mars was slated for 1976. All of that was truncated. All of that was infolded and distorted and hidden. And there have been no human beings to the moon since 1972. Almost now 40 years. And the thrust is to keep human beings on this planet. They call it Earth. We call it Terra. And not let human beings not only step on the moon, maybe in another 15 or 20 years, we might send some military people to have some kind of a beginning outpost. But if one reads the scientific journals, this week's Nature lets the cat out of the bag. There's no intention to let human beings off the planet because they're not easily controllable if human beings begin to populate the star system. There is no authoritarian empire on Earth that can curtail the expansion of a stellar mankind. The Great Compton Cosmic Ray Observatory was the first of the great telescopes to go up and performed yeoman's service. But they had spare parts, and so a second Compton Cosmic Ray, Gamma Ray telescope is being manufactured by the military industrial empire, not to look out at cosmic rays, but to look at the Earth to detect any kind of radiation from nuclear material, so that the surveillance will be global, sophisticated, and able to pinpoint the location of any kind of nuclear activity on the globe. And that's being readied for launch later this year. The first quality of understanding Hermetic America is that there is a triumvirate that we have been talking about, a triple braiding, that there is a cosmic scientific quality to it, there is a philosophic learning quality to it, And there is then a transformational quality to be able to change the things of the world and to change the things of our symbolic thought structure. These three together, cosmology, alchemy, and philosophy, were always braided together as the core of the Hermetic tradition. It was echoed in a parallel in China, and the only places on the planet that developed a viable alchemy, for instance, was the Greek, Egyptian Hermeticists and the Chinese Taoists. And it's only Chinese alchemy and Hellenistic alchemy that really were able to found and develop themselves to the point to where they were verging on becoming sciences in a way which we would recognize, sciences of chemistry and biochemistry, of botany, of a whole range of sciences. And in both sides of the world, in China and in the Hellenistic Roman era, those developments were curtailed. They were folded in, very much like the manned space program in the late 60s, early 1970s. So that it was only with the rediscovery of the Hermetic tradition in the Renaissance that sciences were able to re-emerge, and rather quickly, because they had already been prepared. They were ready to come out 1,000 years before. In China, it took more than just a renaissance. It took an inculcation from the West into China to bring its new sciences and awaken a Chinese response that, well, we can have those sciences as well, and to then discover for themselves rather slowly that their own tradition, their own Taoist alchemy, had given them an opportunity to develop nascently sciences in their own right, in their own way. What is important for us to understand is that we live today, this week, this Saturday, on the cutting edge of a precipice of a threshold that can go either way. What is necessary here in terms of philosophy, which is not a discipline, but is classically being a lover of wisdom, of the feminine wisdom, and becoming a suitor to be able to participate in a life with her. And we have talked about in my learning civilization, which is the largest, most complex education ever developed on the planet. And its great first exemplar, the series on Jesus in Alexandria and Mary Magdalene, as an exemplar of how this comes into play in this Hermetic America, is the second exemplar. A third would be stellar civilization. And a fourth, going all through these three, would be the shared presence. The subtitle of Jesus in Alexandria and Mary Magdalene was The Origins of Shared Presence. And that shared presence is not just a couple or a tuned pair, but is expandable into resonant sets upon resonant sets into a cosmos, a harmonic cosmos. And the Harmonia Mundi was exactly the title of Kepler's greatest book some 500 years ago, when he understood it is not a mental order of circles, no matter what you think the center is, but it is a complex, proportionate harmony of elliptical balances that give a shape to a very complex whole. It's not about a target which can be controlled by a mentality that indoctrinates and has the power, but that this is a very complex ballet of ratioing in resonant sets, and that this gives then a different quality to rationality. Rationality is not working from a set, fixed plan so that one then identifies, but one has the play, creative, memorable, artistic, and personal, to play and explore. And one of the great statements of this is by a Hermetic American named John Dewey in a book published in 1929, Individualism, Old and New. And he writes, and then we'll take a break. If I have emphasized the effect upon the wage workers, it is not because the consequences are not equally marked with respect to the few who now enjoy the material emoluments of the system and monopolize its management and control. There will doubtless always be leaders, those who will have the more active and leading share in the intellectual direction of great industrial undertakings. But as long as the direction is more concerned with pecuniary profit than with social utility, the resulting intellectual and moral development will be one-sided and warped. An inevitable result of a cooperatively shared control of industry would be the recognition of final use or consumption as the criterion of valuation, decision, and direction. When the point of view of consumption is supreme in industry, the latter will be socialized, and I see no way of securing its genuine socialization, save as industry is viewed and conducted from the standpoint of the user and enjoyer of services and commodities. For then human values will control economic values. This was at the culmination of Dewey by 1929-30. He was already in his early 70s. A science of education was one of the major concerns of this world-class philosopher, this Hermetic American. But his first essay into learning, his first essay into education, his first philosophical essay was a book called Psychology, published in 1887. And it was a remarkable volume. But it was completely expanded to the point to where within a couple of years he had to have a third edition to show an impress of another Hermetic American who simply blew out the entire field of psychology, and that was William James, because William James published in 1890, just a couple of years later, his great two-volume Principles of Psychology. This is the first publication in the world where the entire science of psychology was laid out in its full spectrum. This is the set of books from which Freud and Jung and Adler and all the rest of them learned. Let's take a little break and we'll come back. Let's come back to our understanding is that we are currently riding a wave, which is a time wave. And like any good surfer knows, you don't ride the crest of the wave. You will be wiped out. You ride the curl, even if it becomes a tunnel, you stay in the curl. There have been many times in human life where the crest of the wave has crashed, and all those riding on the crest of the wave have crashed with it. It has happened hundreds of times, but there also have been times where the curl has been successfully ridden. And when one comes ashore with renewed confidence that the ocean is not an adversary. It's a kind of a wilderness which is a challenge that has a response to it. And in that way, the wilderness becomes one's new home. It's a new scalar, then, of a home. We have looked at the way in which the United States was the most brilliant vision of the New World, which was the pinnacle of the ideas of the Renaissance. That there is a new world of man. The discovery of the Americas in 1492 fits into a time form because 1992 was exactly 500 years later, which was the classic cycle of the phoenix. And when you pair cycles of the phoenix, you get a millennium. And a millennium is a bringing together of those cycles of the phoenix, but in such a way that there is a millennial complement, and bringing those two millennia together, one gets a seal. And that seal of a time form was called an aeon. So that 2,000 years before 1991, 1992 is about 9 BC, which is the date when Jesus was born. Almost 2,000 years to the day before he was born, Abraham was born, so that Jesus is a new threshold of an aeonic seal originated by Abraham, which is why the concern was always the movement from Abraham as the founder of patriarchal development by generations, and the count was specific, that there were 42 generations between Abraham and Jesus. And that it wasn't just 42, but that it was a resonance of 3 sets of 14. But that the first 14 took 1,000 years, it was a millennium, from Abraham to David. It was 1,000 years. So that first 14 generation set is a millennium. The second millennium was split into 2 14 generations of about 500 years, punctuated by the exile, the return from the exile. This quality of portioning out time begins the New Testament. It's the way the Gospel of Matthew begins the New Testament. That there is then a harmonic, proportionate understanding that there are not only holes, but there are ways to seal holes so that they are able to function then in expansions. And it's the expansions of a scalar that involve the future, but they also involve a new past. What was there previous to that time form now becomes resonantly active again. So that one has to be alert and pay attention that as you step into the future expansion, you also need to be like a gunfighter, watching beyond the peripherals, because that is also now activated again and fresh, so that the future and the new past require a special wisdom to navigate, which the mind in its mentality is incapacitated to do so. It cannot do so. Only the transformed mind that now becomes resonantly able to bring into play not only the counting of things, but the ratioing of things. And my phrase for that in the early 70s was ratios of the real. One learns not to be afraid of the noise, because the noise can be put into a music even though initially it sounds like a dissonance. Nevertheless, one can compose. And that the composition is to take the scattered sound and articulate it with spaces of silence, so that now you have notes that can be put into scalars, and that those scalars are the way in which one now composes. So that you have to learn to give articulate breath to the sound of a voice, so that it paces itself, and that language now achieves a poetic. It's able to put into music the understanding of the wisdom transforms. And this is why a true philosophy is always a learning. It's always an inquiry. And when it's an inquiry together, that community that learns together receives a great benefit. They receive the resonance of the harmonic together. They share that. They have that in common. So that a common denominator of the adventure of ideas, as Alfred North Whitehead once called it, the common denominator of the adventure of ideas is that whole community, which is a population that can be a room full, it can be a city full, it can be a planet full. And we have the capacity now technologically to have a planetary community able to learn together. The United States was hermetically founded on a transform of the early colony idea, colonial plans, scattered religious utopia plans, and transformed, first of all by Benjamin Franklin, but that transform was carried by Thomas Jefferson, so that the world of Franklin and Jefferson, this is the great American Revolution bicentennial in 1976, designed by the offices of Charles and Ray Eames here in Santa Monica in Los Angeles. The quality of Jefferson looms enormously important, because he is the first one to be able to take the quality of the inquiry and explorations of Benjamin Franklin and to expand them. While Franklin may have been a minister plenipotentiary during the American Revolutionary War, representing all of the colonies, what he was before that, he was the postmaster of all the colonies together. And he's one of the few people who rode throughout all of the 13 colonies, setting up a national postal road. And at each place he set up new printing shops, provided the young men with instruction of how you set up a shop so it will work, how to learn your trade. And if you can't get paper, I make paper. I will send you paper. If you can't get ink, I make ink. I will send you ink. I will send you everything that you need to function, and I will send it on the postal road. And so Franklin had already set up the idea of a Hermetic America being sealed because the community that then worked together for a whole generation were able to fight together and become free together. This quality of Franklin and Jefferson always has a resolving third that's in play, that is only visible when one understands that this pair that tuned, there's some way that there was a third that was like a handle that was able to take that tuning and pass it on. And the primordial Hermetic American, who was like the handle to the tuning fork of Franklin and Jefferson, was the man that we talked about last week, David Rittenhouse. And Rittenhouse, in fact, was the second president of the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. Franklin was the first, Jefferson was the third, Rittenhouse was the second. What Rittenhouse did, he was a maker of fine instruments. He was able to very refinedly put together, and one of his great refinements, this is a volume published by Princeton University Press, The Rittenhouse Orrery, Princeton's 18th century planetarium. And in fact, Rittenhouse made two of these orreries. And what an orrery is the sun and the moon and all the planets, so that their movements together can be seen in one shot in an instrument that fits inside of a cabinet, so that one is able to look at the movement of the entire star system as a harmonic, with all the ratios correct and right, so that one could predict eclipses or conjunctions by running it ahead at a speeded up rate, or run it backwards and tell when they were in the past. So that the future and the new past now of the entire star system is visible in one look, in one glance. And that was so important that David Rittenhouse's orrery was put in the center of the seal of the College of Philadelphia, which became the University of Pennsylvania. So that when the University of Pennsylvania in 2008 seals something, hermetically seals something, they use this seal. That's what it's called, a seal. The wax is warm. It takes the impression of the seal. That language comes from Cicero, from the art of memory, that the mind is like a wax tablet that will take the impress of a seal, so that if there is a hermetic seal of a time form of the three great braids of the cosmos, the alchemy, and the philosophy of learning together, if that is sealed, a mind now has a new shape. It has a shape where it is no longer static, but is dynamic. And the dynamic mind is one that moves navigationally free in the waves of the time forms, in the circumstances of the world, in the vicissitudes of whatever is there in the culture, in the society, in the challenges, one moves freely. This is the way in which the Hermetic America has functioned courageously for the last 300 years, and was an inheritance from the Renaissance, which was a reawakening of the finest heritage of 2,000 years ago, which itself was an awakening of something that began 2,000 years before that. But we talked about how these time forms are not just one set, but that there are two sets like an undertone. And there's an invisible third set, which is, to use the music again, an overtone. But the overtone is not like the set and its undertone, which always have cycles. The overtone has an unending ecology, so that it's called hermetically eternal. You cannot count it, but it will always function as a dimension of the real for you. And if you are counting the double time cycles accurately and consciously and navigating with freedom within that, eternity will be there to confer upon your sealing that this is real. This does happen. Not only recordable, but trustable for expansion. For not only expansion into the future, into larger scalars, but also at the same time resonate back and transforms the dead past that would have been an undertow, that would have yanked especially on the undertones. It's already devastating to the regular time cycles. But a dead past come back alive that has no way of being worked into is like Attack of the Killer Zombies on the undertones of human organizations, of human endeavors. Because time is the essence of every plan, of everything that we do. And if you don't factor it in, you're going to be wrong. It isn't even a question of gambling. You will lose. So that wisdom is a time-honored way of teaching, learning, so that your alchemy of changing the world and your cosmology of understanding that world in its largest context is not only accurate, but it's real. Not only truthful, but that it is alive. Now, the quality of Rittenhouse's orrery, he made one for Princeton University. It's in the library there. He made another for Philadelphia for Benjamin Franklin's American Philosophical Society, and is there. Two generations after that came a young boy in Chicago whose backyard backed up to what was then the very new University of Chicago. Schools had begun to have special kinds of expansion universities. After the Civil War, there was a great Hermetic American push to not let this happen again. We must have a way of educating a lot of young people. And so state universities were set up in the period of the Reconstruction. And in the midst of that, the understanding was that there needs to be a point guard lead where the emphasis is not just on undergraduates, but the emphasis is on graduate students. And the first graduate student university was Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, and the second was the University of Chicago. And it was at the University of Chicago that there was one of the great developments in Hermetic American history. One of the things that spurred it was those who have been raised in the Midwest know it's peculiar, but it was started by a cow who kicked over a lantern in a stable that caught fire. The whole barn caught fire, and most of the city of Chicago was burnt. So that they had to rebuild almost everything in Chicago. All of the downtown area, all of the stockyard area, all of the lakefront area of Chicago was burnt. And so they had to rebuild everything everywhere completely. And so there was an inrush of architects into Chicago. And of course, because of the competition and the pressure and the Chicagoan ethos, the city of big shoulders, let's not only build it new, let's build it bigger and better than it was. The most potent architect that emerged was named Louis Sullivan. And Louis Sullivan was the first one to be able to understand that there is such a thing as a skyscraper. There is such a thing as a building that reaches into the sky, that is like a beacon of capacity of many free men working together as a community in such a way that this skyscraper is like a little village into itself. Or bigger ones could be like little towns into themselves. And he's the one that gave a special job to a young architect, brash, didn't even have his degree, named Frank Lloyd Wright. And it was the mentorship of Louis Sullivan to Frank Lloyd Wright, alerting him that it is not just enough to have talent, you have to learn how to develop it. And in order to learn how to develop it, you have to understand that the new is going to be extraordinarily new, but that it will be resonant to a very ancient past. And so you have to learn things, not only how do they build buildings, but you have to understand what is shelter. Not only the styles of the designs, what is architecture? What is not just these building materials, but what is the nature of materials? And so under the tutelage, very much like a Hermetic American tradition, the younger Frank Lloyd Wright learned not from an old man, he was in the prime of his life. He was a cantankerous Chicago toughie, but brilliant, somewhat sarcastic. His book of talks to the public was called Kindergarten Chats. All you big businessmen, you important civic people, when you come to me, you're in kindergarten. And here's what I'm going to start you off so that you can begin to hear and to know and to understand. And one of the ways in which he encapsulated it for the arrogant young Frank Lloyd Wright, he said, Wright, behind every building you see is a man that you don't see, the architect. But if you work and live in that building in such a way that you blossom out, you expand, you deepen, you get the kinesthetic tone of how to look into future possibilities and also feel affinity with others in a renewed past, now you have an architecture that has an ecology, as we would say today, but the word they used then was organic. Now you will have an organic architecture. It will not only be rooted in the earth, in the soil, it'll be founded in the rock and reach to the stars. And it's in that Chicago that this young future genius of astronomy grew up. His name was George Ellery Hale, explorer of the universe. This is Helen Wright's great biography of him. He was so interested in making sure that, like David Rittenhouse, he could build his own instruments, that he built an instrument no one had ever built before, a heliospectroscope, a way of not looking at the sun, but of registering its light and calibrating it and teasing out scientific information. It was the first astrophysical instrument in the world, made by a young boy who impressed the University of Chicago people so much that they decided that he needed to be encouraged and that his little telescope from his backyard needed to be enlarged across the fence at the University of Chicago. And he said, well, that's fine, but I want a really good telescope if you're going to do this. But Chicago has too many lights now. It's becoming, big city. We have to have our telescope, even though it's the University of Chicago telescope, in some other locale. And they chose southern Wisconsin on the shores of Lake Geneva. And there, the great Yerkes Observatory was built. And Hale was put in charge of it. But being a Hermetic American and understanding the freedom to navigate larger possibilities, he said, we're in such a situation that the Midwest, with its humidity and bad weather, we have to go to where there's really good weather, very clear seeing. And he got the idea from a man named James Lick, who was a businessman who put up money for a Lick telescope in the mountains above San Jose. And he said, we're going to build an even bigger telescope than the Lick, and we're going to build it on Mount Wilson above Pasadena, California. And so the Mount Wilson telescope was 100 inches. It was the largest telescope the world had ever seen by far. And because Hale was the kind of man that he was, a Hermetic American, after getting the philosophy of learning really going and getting into the rhythm of that creativity and that exploration of possibilities, he said, well, now we have to bring on board people who can utilize this in such a way as to expand the science, not only of astronomy, but of astrophysics. Now, the first astronomical journal in the United States was 1849, but the first astrophysical journal was 1895, George Ellery Hale, and I brought, published by, it was published by the University of Chicago Press, but this centennial published by the American Astronomical Society, 100 years of the astrophysical journal. Now, 1895, of course, is the year that H.G. Wells' The Time Machine came out. It was the trigger of modern science fiction, a whole visionary century of understanding that there is a wider, weirder, more wonderful universe than anyone could have imagined heretofore, and so we're not going to just imagine it, we're going to inquire into it visionarily. And at the same time, Hale was not satisfied with just now a 100-inch and a 60-inch at the same time in Mount Wilson. He said, we need to have something better. And so he began talking. And one of the fellow astronomers that he helped was Edwin Hubble. And Hubble put out this Atlas of Galaxies. This was edited by, a reprint by Alan Sandage, the Carnegie Institution of Washington, D.C. Andrew Carnegie had helped build and fund the great Mount Wilson Observatory and Telescope. There's a beautiful photo, I will make a larger copy, of Edwin Hubble, George Ellery Hale, and Andrew Carnegie with his Scotsman cane and little tam hat and his mufflers, because Scots are always cold, surveying the ground. And Andrew Carnegie is one of those figures who I call an honorary Hermetic American. The first honorary Hermetic American, of course, was the Marquis de Lafayette. Franklin, when he found the young Lafayette, you have to understand, Lafayette was 18 years old. Franklin was in his 70s. So he sent the teenager Lafayette to be one of the generals with George Washington, and it was Lafayette who engineered the great victory in the Battle of Yorktown over General Howe, who had more ships and troops and medals and was just thoroughly out-strategized by the young 19-year-old Lafayette, the Battle of Yorktown. It ended the Revolutionary War. But in the meantime, the deep friendship between the Marquis de Lafayette and Benjamin Franklin expanded so that there came more Hermetic Americans. Thomas Paine, The Rights of Man, and many other publications that angered many in Europe, was welcomed into America, honorary citizen. Another was Joseph Priestley, the great discoverer of oxygen, one of the great chemists of all time, one of the great religious leaders of all time, not of a religion, but of the right to dissent from authorities of religion to find the qualities of the divine echoing inside of one. They were called in England dissenters. And we'll see that one of the great honorary Americans in the late 20th century was also of that dissenter tribe. His initials are C.H. Dodd, and he's the one that wrote the great double commentaries on the Gospel according to John, showing that its language is the language of the Hermetica. The first 50 pages of his introduction are all about how the fourth Gospel and the book of Revelation are Hermetic, poetic language books, putting very clearly that if we want to see Jesus before Christianity, we have to look for a Hermetic Jesus in Alexandria. That's where he lived for the better part of 42 years, developed and left resonances that were active there, not co-opted by a church structure, not put into mentality structures, not made for an individual who fits in to an authority structure, but ways, the great way, of navigating in freedom in the entire cosmos if need be. It may be a wilderness of stars, but in time it will become a jewel-like scintillation of a heavenly home. Not just a mythic phrase, but an actual future. This quality of George Ellery Hale finally resulted, towards the end of his life, dedication of the Palomar Observatory and the Hale Telescope, published by the California Institute of Technology, the 200-inch telescope at Palomar, which was so, in 1948, it was so huge, so monstrously big, and I will bring a big photo of it, next week, but it was a quality that dwarfed the audience that came. I think the floor sat some 300 people. And when you have a photo of the whole floor, the entire right-hand side of the background is just the beginning of the pedestal of the 200-inch telescope, which by 1948 showed us the quality that now there is a new way of charting the heavens. And this is a recent National Geographic Palomar Sky Survey charting the heavens. It was the first time that we had an instrument able to peer into galactic distances far enough and with enough accuracy to actually have a chart of the scalars of the cosmos. It starts with a star system. It goes to the local star systems. It goes to the galactic level out into the known universe and shows us that it is so huge that we have only begun to be able to penetrate it. And it's only in our time with the Hubble telescope that has been pushed out to some 13.75 billion light years. The quality of Hermetic America is that it has not only awakened a range of possibilities of the future, but reawakened the ancient past. And this was something that the American Indians understood when they came to the future-looking American pioneers and brought their awakened Paleolithic resonances back into play. You suddenly had a new vision, possibility of the scope of the human personality. And the American personality became a lens of not only can do, but looking forward to what else can we not dream about, but get busy at. And what else can we bring back from oblivion and freshen it up so that it is redone, so that we get a new basis as well as a new possibility at the same time as we become a creative part in the bridging of that, the future and the new past. We will talk next week about the Dewey School, the John Dewey School. We mentioned a couple of weeks ago that the great little book on the living thoughts of Thomas Jefferson was done by John Dewey. John Dewey, who was born in 1859 in Burlington, Vermont, and who grew up to be one of the greatest philosophers in the world. He lived to be 92, and he was still active at the time of the 1952 election. Harlow Shapley, Edwin Hubble, George Ellery Hale, David Rittenhouse, Franklin, Jefferson, Dewey, William James. These are just the beginnings of Hermetic America. At the same time, the philosophy of John Dewey, a part of the first volume of the Library of Living Philosophers, published LaSalle, Illinois, is a suburb of Chicago. The Open Court Publishing, established in 1887, right at the time that John Dewey wrote his first book, Psychology, 1887, was about the time that Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright were getting to know each other, and another Hermetic American named Paul Karras came over from Europe and started the Open Court. Not only a publishing house, but a periodical, like a journal, and also a school, the Open Court. It was not only a graduate school, like Johns Hopkins or the University of Chicago. It was an ongoing graduate school for the population of a Hermetic America that would like to and needed to, understood they will learn throughout the rest of their lives, and that the classroom size is not even limited by the planet. There are plenty of other star systems. It is a really big classroom. We have some very interesting friends to find out. More next week.